the question hit like a slap. What makes a prince leave his home without warning? Not after a public scandal, not after a confirmed betrayal, but in the quiet aftermath of whispers that refuse to die. Not a press release, not a staged walk, not even a carefully worded denial. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just absence. Because according to multiple reports and swirling online speculation, Prince Harry didn't storm out of Montecito in a blaze of headlines. He slipped away, quietly, abruptly, and for days no one could say where he'd gone or why. So let's start here. Not with certainty, not with proof, but with the moment everything stopped adding up. Because when rumors surfaced suggesting that Meghan Markle may have been privately communicating with one of her most vocal public critics, Piers Morgan, the internet did what it always does. It exploded. But Harry's reaction? That's what raised eyebrows. No fiery rebuttal, no united front, no defiant photo op. Instead, silence, distance, and then reports that he had left Montecito altogether. Ask yourself this: if the allegations were nonsense, why not crush them immediately? If the rumors were harmless, why not laugh them off? And if the marriage was as solid as publicly portrayed, why did the response feel fractured? This story matters now because it sits at the intersection of three volatile forces: celebrity, marriage, and narrative control. And when those collide, truth often becomes less important than perception, especially when the people involved have spent years fighting the press, only to be dragged back into its glare by a story they didn't choose. Or did they? Let's rewind. For years, the public narrative has been simple. Meghan and Piers are adversaries, enemies, locked in a long-running media war marked by on-air denunciations, interviews dripping with contempt, and moments so explosive they became cultural flashpoints. On the surface, it looked clean, clear, binary. But here's the contradiction that refuses to go away. Some of the loudest public feuds in media history have masked something else entirely. Private conversations, back channels, moments of unexpected civility, or even strategic engagement hidden behind theatrical outrage. Is it possible that what we saw on television wasn't the full story? I'm not asking you to believe the rumors. I'm asking you to question the simplicity of the narrative. Because when allegations began circulating online, largely unverified, amplified by tabloids and social media accounts, hungry for engagement, they didn't just accuse. They insinuated, they hinted at emotional proximity, at private communication, at a contradiction so sharp it could destabilize a marriage already under strain. And according to sources close to the situation, what allegedly unsettled Harry wasn't a headline. It was the idea that something had been kept from him. Think about that for a moment. In relationships, especially ones forged under global scrutiny, secrecy often hurts more than the content of what's hidden. A message can be innocent. A conversation can be contextual. But the act of concealing communication with someone publicly framed as hostile, that's where doubt creeps in. That's where trust starts to wobble. Now, let's be clear. No verified evidence has surfaced proving an affair. No confirmed documentation has been released. No first-hand admissions exist. But rumors don't need proof to cause damage. They need timing. And the timing here was brutal. These allegations surfaced during the period when Harry and Meghan were already navigating intense pressure, professional setbacks, media fatigue, public skepticism, and the long shadow of previous interviews that had divided opinion. So when whispers began to circulate that Meghan may have maintained a private channel of communication with Piers Morgan, a man whose public criticism of her has been relentless, the question wasn't just, is this true? The question was, why now? Who benefits from this narrative? Why resurrect this rivalry in such a personal way? And why did Harry's behavior appear to change almost immediately afterward? According to reports, he didn't confront the press. He retreated. That's the part no one can explain away easily, because Harry has never been known for quiet exits. His pattern, historically, has been confrontation followed by clarification. Speak out, push back, correct the record. So why didn't he this time? Some insiders suggest he needed space. Others say he was overwhelmed by the noise. A few speculate that the allegations, true or not, reopened deeper insecurities about trust, about control, about whether the private world he believed in was as protected as he thought. And then there's another uncomfortable angle. What if the most destabilizing element wasn't the rumor itself, but Harry's realization that he no longer recognized the battlefield? For years, he believed the threat came from outside, the tabloids, the commentators, the institutions. But what happens when the perceived threat appears to originate closer to home? Not as betrayal, but as ambiguity. Ambiguity is corrosive because it forces you to question everything. Every late-night message, every unexplained reaction, every silence that once felt normal. Was it always like this? Or did something shift? Here's where the story becomes less about scandal and more about psychology. High-profile couples don't live in reality the way the rest of us do. Their lives are layered with performance, public selves, strategic silence, carefully managed leaks. But marriage doesn't thrive in layers. It thrives in clarity. And according to observers watching closely, clarity was exactly what seemed to be missing in the days following the allegations. Harry's absence wasn't loud. It was telling. No joint appearance, no coordinated response, no reassuring signals to fans or critics alike. Just distance. And that distance created a vacuum. One the media rushed to fill. Suddenly, every old clip of Piers Morgan criticizing Meghan resurfaced, now reframed through a new lens. Every past interaction was reinterpreted. Every harsh word became suspicious. Every contradiction magnified. Was the feud genuine or performative? Were the attacks personal or strategic? And if there was private communication, what did it mean? Let me ask you something. If someone publicly attacks you for years, but privately engages with you, which version do you believe? The public one or the private one? That question alone is enough to fracture trust. And for Harry, a man shaped by betrayal narratives, haunted by perceived disloyalty from institutions he once trusted, the psychological impact of even a rumor like this could be enormous, especially if he felt blindsided, especially if he felt excluded, especially if he felt the story unfolding wasn't one he controlled. Because control, or the loss of it, has been a recurring theme in his life. So when reports emerged that he had left Montecito, the focus shouldn't have been where he went, it should have been why he felt the need to go at all. Was it an escape, a cooling-off period, or a silent protest, the only form of agency left when words no longer feel safe? We don't know. And that's what makes this moment so powerful. This isn't a story about proving an affair. It's a story about what happens when rumors strike at the foundation of trust, and how people react when certainty collapses. Because sometimes the most revealing actions aren't the ones taken on camera. They're the ones taken in silence. And according to those watching closely, Harry's silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. Loaded with questions he may not have wanted to ask out loud. Loaded with doubts he couldn't dismiss with logic alone. Loaded with the realization that the narrative around his marriage might be shifting in ways he couldn't control. And here's the part no one was prepared for. According to several media watchers, the story didn't stop with his departure. Because as attention focused on Harry's absence, a new layer of information, still fragmentary, still disputed, began to circulate. Hints of a communication trail, whispers of intermediaries, and claims that someone outside the marriage may have been influencing the narrative far more than anyone realized. If true, it would change everything. Not because of romance, but because of power. Because the moment an external voice gains emotional or strategic influence inside a marriage already under siege, the balance shifts. And that's where this story truly begins. Because what came next wasn't louder, it was darker. And according to sources, it's the reason Harry didn't just leave the house. He left the conversation. If silence can speak, then that silence screamed, because what happened next wasn't a press statement or a neatly sourced palace insider quote. It was movement. Sudden, deliberate movement. And for those watching closely, it looked less like a cooling-off period and more like a quiet evacuation. Here's the question no one could answer at first. Why would Prince Harry leave without saying a word? Not a symbolic walkout, not a dramatic confrontation, but a disappearance so understated it almost went unnoticed. Until it didn't. This is where Chapter 1 begins. Not with rumor, not with accusation, but with a timeline that refuses to behave like a coincidence. Because according to multiple reports circulating in media and online forums, Harry didn't leave Montecito after a loud argument. He didn't storm out following a public humiliation. He didn't even leave after a confirmed revelation. He left after something quieter. And sometimes, quiet is more dangerous than chaos. Let's reconstruct that night. Not theatrically, logically. The evening before his departure appeared, on the surface, ordinary. No scheduled appearances. No dramatic leaks, no visible crisis management. Just the familiar stillness of a couple whose lives had been under constant observation for years. And then, within hours, Harry was gone. No cameras caught it, no paparazzi photos surfaced immediately. No friendly outlet was tipped off. That alone was unusual. Ask yourself this: when high-profile couples separate, even temporarily, doesn't the media usually know before we do? So why didn't they this time? The answer may lie in how fast everything happened. According to speculation, Harry didn't announce his decision. He acted on it, which suggests something had shifted internally, not slowly, not gradually, but sharply, a tipping point. And here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Sources close to the situation claim that the departure wasn't preceded by shouting or accusations. Instead, it followed a moment of realization, one that didn't require proof, only implication. Because when trust erodes, it doesn't collapse all at once. It fractures. Tiny cracks, unanswered questions, a sense that something is being withheld. And then one thought settles in your mind and refuses to leave. What don't I know? Think about how that feels. Not anger, not rage, just uncertainty. Uncertainty is paralyzing. And for someone like Harry, whose life has been defined by betrayal narratives, media distortion, and institutional distrust, uncertainty isn't just uncomfortable. It's intolerable. So when whispers began circulating online suggesting that Meghan Markle may have been in private communication with someone publicly positioned as hostile, the issue wasn't whether the whispers were true. The issue was whether they were possible. Possibility alone can destabilize a relationship, and according to observers, that possibility landed like a delayed shockwave. Now here's where things get more specific. Reports indicate that Harry didn't leave with a suitcase packed days in advance. This wasn't a premeditated exit. It was a short departure, essentials only, enough for distance, not for finality. That detail matters, because it suggests he didn't leave to end something. He left to think, and thinking, in moments like this, can be dangerous, because once you start replaying interactions through a new lens, nothing looks the same. A delayed response suddenly feels intentional. A neutral comment feels loaded. A silence feels strategic. And according to speculation, Harry began doing exactly that. Replaying. When did the tone shift? When did things stop feeling transparent? When did "we're in this together" quietly become "I'll handle it"? The human brain is ruthless when doubt enters the room. And here's where the timeline tightens. The rumors that triggered this moment didn't emerge randomly. They appeared after a renewed burst of media commentary involving a familiar antagonist, Piers Morgan, whose public criticisms of Meghan had long been treated as noise, until suddenly they weren't, because the narrative shifted from attack to contradiction. And contradiction is destabilizing. How can someone publicly condemn you while allegedly maintaining private contact? How can hostility coexist with familiarity? And why would that dynamic exist at all? Again, no proof has surfaced. But proof isn't always the trigger. Sometimes suspicion is enough. And suspicion, once planted, grows quietly. What's striking is what didn't happen next. Harry didn't issue a denial. He didn't demand a public correction. He didn't immediately rally support from friendly media. Instead, he withdrew. That withdrawal is the story, because historically, Harry has fought narratives head-on. interviews, statements, emotional rebuttals. This time, he chose distance. And distance suggests something internal was unfolding, something not ready for the world. So where did he go? Reports vary. Some say he stayed nearby, others suggest he went somewhere deliberately disconnected from the media cycle. But the location matters less than the intention. This wasn't about hiding, it was about separation. Separation from noise, separation from pressure, separation from a conversation he may not have felt equipped to have yet. Ask yourself this: if you believed your marriage was under attack from outside forces, you'd close ranks. But if you suspected the fracture might be inside the marriage itself, wouldn't you need space? That's the difference. And that difference is what makes this moment so telling. Because nothing fuels speculation like silence paired with action. As Harry's absence became noticeable, speculation exploded. Not because of what people knew, but because of what they didn't. Was he angry? Was he hurt? Was he blindsided? Or was he questioning everything he thought he understood? Those questions multiplied because no one was answering them. And then something else happened, subtle but significant. The usual background noise of sources close to the couple went quiet. No reassuring leaks, no anonymous insistence that everything was fine, no framing of the departure as a misunderstanding. That absence suggested uncertainty even within their inner circle. And when insiders don't know which story to sell, it usually means the story isn't settled yet. Now let's address the uncomfortable possibility. What if Harry didn't leave because of what he learned, but because of how he learned it? There's a difference. Discovering something through your partner is painful. Discovering it through rumor is worse. And discovering it after realizing your partner didn't tell you something they perhaps should have, that's destabilizing, because then the question isn't about the content, it's about trust. Trust that you're being looped in. Trust that you're not the last to know. Trust that you're still a team. And according to media analysts, Harry's reaction suggested that trust was being reevaluated. Not broken. Re-evaluated. That distinction matters, because leaving to reevaluate isn't the same as leaving to abandon. It's the act of someone who hasn't decided what they believe yet. Someone who needs quiet to hear their own thoughts. And here's where the story deepens. Observers note that the departure coincided with a noticeable shift in tone from Meghan's side. Less visibility, less engagement, less narrative correction. That doesn't imply guilt, it implies recalibration. When both sides go quiet, it often means conversations are happening offstage. Conversations we're not meant to hear, but silence breeds interpretation. And interpretation is where narratives turn dangerous. Because once the public fills in the blanks, regaining control becomes nearly impossible. Which brings us to the most unsettling detail of all. According to reports, Harry didn't announce when or if he'd return. No time frame, no reassurance, just absence. That's not the behavior of someone playing a PR game. That's the behavior of someone grappling with a personal reckoning. And that reckoning didn't begin with an accusation. It began with a question. Is there something about my marriage I don't fully understand? That question is devastating, because once you ask it, you can't unask it. And according to those following closely, Harry's departure wasn't an ending, it was a pause before something larger. Because while he was gone, the narrative didn't cool, it intensified. More speculation surfaced. More reinterpretations emerged. More old footage was dragged into new contexts, and suddenly, what looked like a private moment of reflection became a public spectacle. One neither side seemed prepared to confront yet, which raises the next unavoidable question. If Harry left to gain clarity, what did he uncover while he was gone? Because according to emerging whispers, his absence coincided with something else coming into focus. Something involving communication channels, intermediaries, and a version of events that didn't match the public story. And if that's true, then the night Harry vanished wasn't the crisis, it was the calm before it. Because what came next wouldn't stay quiet. And when it surfaced, it would force everyone involved to confront a narrative far more complicated and far more destabilizing than a single rumor. But that part of the story didn't reveal itself immediately. It waited. Montecito didn't change. That's what made it unsettling. The palm trees still leaned lazily in the afternoon light. The gates still closed with the same soft finality. The ocean air still carried that curated calm. People pay millions to live inside. From the outside, nothing had happened. And yet, something had. Because when Prince Harry left, the stillness that followed wasn't peaceful. It was artificial, the kind of quiet that exists when everyone inside a room is pretending nothing is wrong. This is chapter 2, and it's not about what exploded. It's about what didn't. Here's the contradiction that immediately raised eyebrows among media watchers and royal commentators. If this were just a rumor, flimsy, unserious, destined to burn out, the standard playbook would have been obvious. A leak, a denial, a smiling appearance. A background briefing reassuring everyone that the marriage was solid and the story nonsense. But that didn't happen. Instead, Montecito went dark. No casual sightings, no friendly photos, no subtle messaging through sympathetic outlets. Ask yourself something. When has silence ever helped a celebrity narrative? Especially one already under strain? For a couple that has historically understood the power of shaping their own story, this absence of counter-narrative felt deliberate or forced. And either option carries weight. Because when people who usually control the narrative stop controlling it, one of two things is happening. They're choosing restraint, or they're scrambling. From the outside, Montecito projected serenity. From the inside, according to speculation, it felt more like a holding pattern, a place frozen in time, waiting for clarity that hadn't arrived yet. This matters because location shapes perception. Montecito isn't just a town, it's a symbol of retreat, of reinvention, of escape from old institutions and old expectations. It was supposed to be the place where Harry and Meghan Markle finally lived on their own terms. So what does it mean when that place becomes the epicenter of unanswered questions? Some observers noted a subtle but telling shift. Staff movements changed, routines reportedly adjusted, the usual hum of activity slowed. No chaos, no drama, just recalibration. And recalibration implies something is being reassessed. Now, before we go further, let's be precise. There is no verified evidence that anything illegal, immoral, or romantic occurred between Meghan and Piers Morgan. The rumors circulating online are unverified, heavily editorialized, and often contradictory. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Rumors don't need to be true to be disruptive. They just need to intersect with existing tension. And the tension in Montecito didn't begin with this story. It had been building quietly for months. Professional setbacks, public skepticism, media fatigue. The slow realization that controlling the narrative doesn't mean controlling public opinion. When a couple is already navigating that landscape, even a baseless rumor can feel like an existential threat. Not because of what it claims, but because of what it forces you to confront. Trust, transparency, and the question of who knows what, and when. According to those familiar with celebrity crisis patterns, the silence from Montecito suggested internal deliberation rather than dismissal. That's a crucial distinction, because dismissal looks confident, deliberation looks cautious, and caution implies uncertainty. Let's talk about optics. From a public relations standpoint, allowing a rumor to dominate the conversation without immediate response is risky. It invites speculation. It encourages reinterpretation of past events. It gives oxygen to voices that thrive on ambiguity. So why take that risk? One theory is that no response felt safe yet, because any response would have required alignment, and alignment may not have existed in that moment. If Harry and Meghan were not on the same page about how to address the rumors, or whether to address them at all, silence becomes the default. Not because it's effective, but because it avoids escalation while decisions are still being made. And this is where Montecito becomes less of a backdrop and more of a pressure cooker. Picture it. A home designed to be a refuge now functioning as a staging ground for uncertainty. Every room filled with echoes of conversations that didn't happen. Every quiet moment stretched thin by questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Did this need to be addressed? Was it better to ignore it? Was engaging with the rumor more damaging than staying silent? And most importantly, what did Harry need? Because according to reports, his departure wasn't just physical. It was psychological. Distance creates perspective, but it also creates asymmetry. When one partner leaves to process, the other is left to manage perception. And perception is ruthless. As days passed, online speculation grew more elaborate. Old interviews were clipped and recontextualized. Past comments from Piers Morgan were replayed with new insinuations. The long-standing public feud between him and Meghan began to look, to some observers, less straightforward. Again, not proof. But narratives don't wait for proof. They wait for gaps. And Montecito was full of them. What fueled the speculation further was the absence of the usual counterweight, Harry himself. No visible defense. No public alignment. No joint narrative. That absence allowed a subtle question to creep into the discourse. Was Harry distancing himself from the rumor, or from the situation that birthed it? That's a dangerous question for any marriage to face publicly, because once it's asked, every subsequent action becomes symbolic. A delayed appearance looks calculated. A neutral statement looks evasive. A smile looks forced. And that's exactly what seemed to be happening. Observers noted that even unrelated public moments felt different. Subdued, cautious, stripped of their usual confidence. That doesn't mean guilt. It means awareness. Awareness that the story had moved beyond control. Let's address another contradiction. If the rumor were entirely fabricated, one would expect swift legal or reputational pushback, especially given the couple's history of challenging media narratives. But no such pushback materialized. Why? One possibility is strategic restraint. Engaging could amplify the rumor. Another possibility is internal debate about how best to proceed. Or, and this is the option people find hardest to sit with, the rumor intersected with something real enough to require careful handling. Not an affair, not wrongdoing, but communication. And communication, especially when it involves someone publicly framed as an adversary, is a sensitive issue. Ask yourself, if your partner were rumored to be communicating privately with someone who had publicly attacked them for years, wouldn't you at least want clarity? Not accusation, not confrontation. Clarity. And clarity takes time. Time Harry seemed to need away from Montecito, which brings us back to the illusion of calm. From the outside, Montecito looked untouched. From the inside, it may have been anything but. The lack of visible conflict doesn't indicate peace. It often indicates restraint, the kind that precedes difficult conversations. And those conversations don't happen on camera. They happen in pauses, in distance, in moments when one person leaves, so both can think. The problem is, the world doesn't pause with you. While Montecito remained silent, the narrative filled the void. Commentators speculated about power dynamics, about emotional labor, about whether Meghan's public independence had evolved into something Harry felt excluded from. Again, speculation. But speculation has momentum, and momentum is hard to stop once it starts rolling. What's striking is that no one rushed to shut it down, which suggests the story wasn't yet settled internally. Because if you don't know what you believe, how can you tell the world what to believe? That's the trap. And Montecito, once a symbol of certainty and escape, became a symbol of suspension, a place where decisions were pending and clarity. Now here's where things get more complicated. According to media analysts, the silence itself became a message that said, something is being processed, and processing implies substance. Not necessarily wrongdoing, but something worth considering. Which brings us to the most revealing part of this chapter. As days passed, attention quietly shifted from the rumor itself to the reaction around it. People stopped asking, is this true? And started asking, why does this feel unresolved? That's when the story matured. Because unresolved stories don't fade. They deepen. And while Montecito stayed outwardly serene, new whispers began to circulate. Not about romance, but about access. Who had Meghan been talking to? Through whom? And for what purpose? Questions about intermediaries. Questions about messaging. Questions about whether the public feud masked a more complex dynamic behind the scenes. If true, it wouldn't be scandalous in the tabloid sense. It would be destabilizing in the relational sense, because when one partner feels they're not fully aware of who has influence in the other's world, trust erodes, even without betrayal. And that erosion doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly, the way Montecito went quiet. And that's why this chapter matters. Because before any confrontation, before any confirmation or denial, before any public reckoning, there was a pause. A pause filled with questions no one wanted to ask and answers no one was ready to give. And according to those watching closely, that pause didn't last, because while Montecito stayed silent, something else began to surface. Something that suggested this wasn't just about rumor management. It was about communication channels no one was supposed to notice. And when those channels came into focus, the story took a turn no one expected. What made this next phase so volatile wasn't the rumor itself. It was the contradiction. Because for years, the relationship between Meghan and Piers had been framed as pure hostility. Loud, personal, public. A feud so consistent that it became shorthand, the kind of rivalry audiences stop questioning because it feels permanent. And yet, suddenly, that permanence looked performative. This is where Chapter 3 begins, with a question that feels uncomfortable precisely because it undermines what everyone thought they understood. What if the loudest feud in this story wasn't the most honest one? Let's slow this down. Publicly, the dynamic had been simple. Harsh criticism, sharp monologues, headlines built on outrage, a narrative of rejection and resentment that played well on television and even better online. It was easy to digest. Good versus bad, attacker versus target, noise versus dignity. But real life is rarely that neat, because behind almost every public feud in modern media, there exists a private layer the audience never sees. Back channels, messages passed through intermediaries, strategic engagement disguised as opposition. That doesn't make it sinister. It makes it human. And when rumors began circulating that Meghan may have maintained some form of private communication with someone so publicly hostile, the issue wasn't scandal, it was symmetry. Because public hatred paired with private communication doesn't cancel out, it complicates. Ask yourself this: if someone publicly criticizes you relentlessly, but privately reaches out, which version of them do you trust? And if you're married to someone under constant attack, wouldn't you expect to know who's speaking to them, even indirectly? This is where the story starts to move away from gossip and into psychology. Because what destabilizes relationships isn't always betrayal, it's misalignment. According to analysts watching the situation unfold, the rumor gained traction not because it was sensational, but because it exposed a contradiction people had never considered before. If the feud was absolute, why would private lines exist at all? If communication existed, why was the hostility so performative? And if the hostility was real, why would communication continue? There are explanations: professional overlap, media necessity, attempts at de-escalation, even strategic engagement meant to manage narrative fallout. All of those are plausible. None of them are inherently romantic. But here's the problem. Plausible doesn't mean harmless, especially when the relationship at the center of the storm has already been defined by distrust toward the media ecosystem. From Harry's perspective, at least as speculated by commentators, the public feud was familiar territory. He understood enemies. He understood attacks. He knew how to respond to visible threats. What he may not have been prepared for was ambiguity. Ambiguity is harder to fight than hostility, because hostility has edges, ambiguity has shadows, and shadows make people imagine things. The rumor didn't suggest passion, it suggested access, and access is power. Power to influence narrative, power to reframe perception, power to shape what's said publicly while negotiating privately. If that power existed, even hypothetically, it would explain why Harry's reaction appeared so inward. Because that's not something you rage against. It's something you sit with. And once you sit with it, you start replaying the past. Every time the feud escalated publicly, every time a comment seemed especially sharp, every moment when outrage felt calibrated. Was it always genuine? Or was some of it strategic? These questions don't accuse, they corrode. Now, it's important to underline this clearly. There is no evidence confirming a secret affair. There is no verified proof of improper conduct. There is no documented exchange proving intimacy. What exists is speculation layered on top of contradiction. And contradiction is fertile ground for doubt. The public war narrative worked because it was simple, but simplicity rarely survives scrutiny. When viewers began revisiting old footage, old interviews, old commentary, something subtle emerged. The feud was loud, but oddly repetitive. The language didn't evolve. The positions stayed fixed. The outrage remained consistent. That consistency raised a question. Was the feud emotional, or was it performative? In modern media, performance isn't deception, it's currency. And public conflict drives attention, which leads to another uncomfortable possibility. What if both sides benefited from the feud continuing publicly? Not in a conspiratorial way, but in a structural one. Outrage equals relevance. Relevance equals leverage. If that were true, then the existence of private communication wouldn't contradict the public war. It would complement it. And that's the kind of realization that makes people uncomfortable. Because it blurs moral lines. It suggests the conflict wasn't about truth or justice, but about positioning. For Harry, that realization, if it even crossed his mind, would have been deeply destabilizing. Because his relationship with the media has always been framed as a battle against manipulation. So the idea that manipulation could exist inside the narrative he trusted, that's not something you dismiss lightly. And here's where timing becomes everything. The rumors didn't surface during a peak moment of chaos. They surfaced during fatigue, when energy was low, when patience was thin, when resilience had been worn down by years of conflict. In that context, even a weak rumor can feel overwhelming, because it lands on already bruised ground. What followed was a subtle but telling shift in how people discussed the feud. Instead of asking whether the criticisms were fair, people began asking whether they were sincere. That's a dangerous pivot, because sincerity is hard to prove and impossible to reclaim once questioned. And while the public debated, Harry withdrew. Which makes sense, because how do you confront a contradiction without evidence? How do you challenge a narrative that exists mostly in implication? You don't argue it, you step back from it. And that's exactly what seemed to happen. Observers noted that Harry didn't engage with the feud at all during this period. No defensive posture, no alignment with the public narrative, no visible participation. It was as if he was no longer reacting to the external war, because his attention had shifted inward, toward meaning, toward trust, toward the question that sits beneath all rumors. What's really going on? And that question doesn't demand immediate answers. It demands time, which brings us back to why this chapter matters. Because the feud, once framed as a straightforward battle, became something else entirely. A mirror reflecting not just public conflict, but private uncertainty. And once a mirror cracks, you don't just see what's in front of you, you see fragments. Fragments of conversations, fragments of intentions, fragments of stories that no longer align cleanly. That fragmentation is what turned a rumor into a reckoning, not because it was proven, but because it was possible. And possibility is enough to destabilize trust. As analysts dug deeper, another detail emerged. The feud had moments of restraint that didn't match its intensity. Moments where escalation stopped short. Moments where silence followed particularly sharp exchanges. Moments where opportunities to destroy the other side publicly weren't taken. At the time, those pauses seemed irrelevant. Now, they look deliberate. Again, not evidence. But pattern recognition doesn't require proof to feel persuasive. For Harry, pattern recognition has always been a double-edged sword. He's lived through moments where patterns were real, where institutions closed ranks and truths were obscured. So when patterns emerge in his personal life, it's unlikely he'd ignore them, even if they lead somewhere uncomfortable. Especially if they lead somewhere uncomfortable. Which raises the next question. If the feud wasn't as simple as it looked, what else wasn't? And if public hostility masked private engagement, who knew about it? And who didn't? Because that's the heart of this chapter. Not scandal, disclosure. Who was looped in, who wasn't, and when. In relationships under pressure, secrecy isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's protective, but protection without consent can feel like exclusion. And exclusion, over time, breeds resentment. So when Harry stepped away, it wasn't necessarily because he believed the worst. It may have been because he couldn't reconcile the versions of reality in front of him, the public one, the rumored one, and the private one he didn't fully understand yet. That reconciliation takes space, and space is what he took. As this chapter closes, the focus shifts again. Because while the public debated feud dynamics and rumor credibility, something quieter began to surface. Something less about personalities and more about pathways. Communication pathways, intermediaries, informal channels, connections that didn't fit the clean narrative of total separation. And according to those tracking the story closely, those pathways, not the feud itself, are what truly unsettled Harry. Because once you realize influence can travel invisibly, you start questioning where else it might have gone. And that's when the story stops being about who said what publicly and starts being about who had access privately. Once you start thinking in terms of access, everything changes. Because access doesn't announce itself. It doesn't trend. It doesn't scream for attention the way public feuds do. It moves quietly, behind the scenes, through people and platforms most audiences never see. And that's why the next layer of this story felt so unsettling to those watching closely. The rumors didn't point to romance, they pointed to reach. Who could speak to whom without the noise of cameras? Who could influence perception without stepping into the spotlight? Who could shape a narrative while appearing to oppose it? That's the contradiction that refuses to settle. Public hostility is visible. It's loud. It's performative. But private communication, even limited, even strategic, carries weight precisely because it's unseen. Now imagine being in a marriage that has spent years fighting the idea that outsiders manipulate your life. Imagine building your identity around the belief that you and your partner are united against external forces. Then imagine realizing that one of the loudest external forces might not be entirely external after all. That realization doesn't require proof to hurt. It only requires plausibility. This is where people misunderstand what's happening. They assume the damage comes from the allegation itself. It doesn't. It comes from what the allegation forces you to ask. Who has access to my partner's thoughts? Who gets private context that I don't? Who influences how stories are framed before they ever reach the public? Those questions are corrosive because they don't accuse, they destabilize. And once destabilization sets in, even innocent explanations feel insufficient. Media analysts began noticing something else at this stage. The public feud, when examined closely, followed a rhythm. Outrage. Response. Silence. Reset. It was cyclical, predictable, almost ritualistic. That doesn't mean it was fake. It means it was contained. Contained conflict often signals boundaries, and boundaries imply communication, even if indirect. This is common in media ecosystems. Public adversaries often know exactly how far to go. They escalate just enough to generate attention, then pull back to avoid irreversible damage. Why? Because total destruction helps no one. That pattern, once noticed, became impossible to ignore. And it reframed everything. Suddenly, the feud didn't look like chaos. It looked managed. Now, let's pause and be careful here. Managed doesn't mean coordinated in some secret alliance. It can mean something far more mundane. Shared understanding of media rules, mutual awareness of consequences, or even third-party mediation through agents, producers. That's how modern media works. But when those mechanisms intersect with a marriage already under pressure, they become volatile. Because from the inside, management can feel like secrecy, and secrecy feels like exclusion. That's the emotional pivot point of this chapter. Because exclusion doesn't require malicious intent to hurt. All it requires is asymmetry. One partner knows more than the other. One partner navigates a terrain the other doesn't see. One partner feels outpaced. And suddenly, the partnership doesn't feel equal anymore. Observers noted that this phase of the story marked a shift in how Harry was perceived. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't publicly wounded. He looked removed. Removed suggests reflection. Reflection suggests doubt. And doubt, once it takes hold, doesn't care about reassurances. Reassurances are words. Doubt listens to patterns. Patterns like repeated silence after heated exchanges. Patterns like criticism that never crosses certain lines. Patterns like enemies who seem to understand each other too well. Again, none of this proves anything. But proof isn't the currency here. Coherence is. People began asking whether the public narrative and the private reality aligned. And when alignment feels off, trust starts to thin. The most telling aspect of this phase wasn't what was said, it was what wasn't. No one rushed to clarify the nature of any alleged communication. No one explained whether contact existed or not. No one drew a hard boundary publicly. That absence allowed speculation to harden. And speculation, once hardened, behaves like fact. Now consider the emotional context. This wasn't happening at the height of confidence. It was happening during recalibration, during a period where professional ambitions, public reception, and personal resilience were all being reassessed. In moments like that, tolerance for ambiguity is low. Everything feels heavier. So when rumors suggested blurred boundaries, not romantic, but relational, the impact was amplified. And that's when the feud stopped being about public insults. It became about private alignment. Who is truly on which side? And perhaps more importantly, who decides what sides even mean? For someone who has spent years framing the world as us versus them, the idea that them might not be clearly defined anymore is deeply unsettling. It collapses the map. And when your map collapses, you don't march forward. You stop, you retreat, you reassess. Which brings us back to why this chapter exists. Because the contradiction at the heart of the story isn't about infidelity, it's about narrative authority. Who controls the story when public and private realities diverge? And what happens when one partner realizes they may not be fully inside the loop? That realization doesn't trigger confrontation, it triggers silence. And silence is what we saw. As the public feud continued to be replayed, dissected, and debated, Harry remained absent, physically and rhetorically. That absence was its own message. It suggested he wasn't interested in playing the public game anymore, at least not until he understood the private one. And understanding takes time. Time away from noise. Time away from scripts. Time away from roles. Time to ask questions without microphones. But the world didn't wait. While he stepped back, the narrative kept evolving. New voices weighed in. New theories emerged. New interpretations layered themselves onto old footage. And slowly, the focus shifted again, away from the feud, toward the mechanics behind it. People began asking not who hated whom, but how messages moved. Who spoke directly? Who spoke indirectly? Who spoke through intermediaries? And that's when something important happened. The rumor ecosystem matured. It stopped being about scandal and started being about structure. Structure of influence. Structure of access. Structure of power behind public narratives. That's a far more dangerous conversation. Because once audiences start interrogating structure, surface-level denials lose effectiveness. You can deny intent. You can deny emotion. But you can't easily deny systems. And systems, once questioned, demand transparency. Transparency that may not be immediately available. This is where the chapter bends toward its cliff. Because according to media observers, the next phase didn't involve louder accusations. It involved quieter revelations, hints that communication wasn't direct, but facilitated. Suggestions that intermediaries existed. Claims that messages didn't travel in straight lines. If true, it would explain everything. The restraint, the repetition, the lack of escalation. It would suggest the feud functioned as a public performance layered over a more complex private reality. Again, not proof. but plausible enough to unsettle someone already questioning alignment. And if Harry began to suspect that the story he thought he was fighting wasn't the whole story, that the battlefield had back channels he didn't fully understand, then leaving wasn't avoidance. It was strategy. Strategy to regain footing. Because you can't confront what you don't understand. And you can't understand something while you're standing inside it. So, you step away. You create distance. You look at the system from the outside, which is exactly what seemed to be happening. And according to emerging whispers, that distance allowed something else to come into focus. Not a confession, not a revelation, but a pattern. A pattern involving communication routes that had never been publicly acknowledged. And once that pattern surfaced, it reframed the entire situation, because the story was no longer about whether the feud was real. It was about who knew what and who didn't. And that question, once asked, doesn't go away. The pattern didn't announce itself. It emerged slowly, like a shape forming in fog. At first, it looked like coincidence, then alignment, and finally, something that felt deliberate enough to demand attention. Because when analysts began mapping the way narratives moved, not the narratives themselves, but how they traveled, a new question took center stage. If messages weren't direct, who carried them? This chapter isn't about secret meetings or dramatic exchanges. It's about infrastructure, the invisible architecture of communication that exists around high-profile figures, whether they want it or not. And once you see that architecture, you can't unsee it. Here's the unsettling reality of modern media power. Most communication doesn't happen person to person anymore. It happens through layers: agents, producers, editors, mutual contacts, casual intermediaries who pass along context, temperature, or sentiment without ever labeling it as a message. That's not sinister. It's standard. But standard doesn't mean harmless, because when communication moves through intermediaries, intention blurs, accountability thins, and plausible deniability expands. Which is why the idea of a secret channel doesn't have to mean a hidden phone or a locked-in box. It can mean something far more mundane and far more destabilizing. It can mean someone else speaking on your behalf without you realizing the full impact. So let's talk about what people started noticing. As the public feud continued its familiar rhythm, a few commentators pointed out that certain story beats landed with uncanny timing. A harsh comment would surface. Then, almost immediately, a counter-narrative would appear elsewhere, not as a rebuttal, but as a reframing. Not denial, not escalation, recontextualization. Those reframings didn't originate from the obvious camps. They came from adjacent spaces. Friendly commentators, neutral platforms, third-party voices that seemed oddly well-informed. Again, this proves nothing, but it raises a question. How did so many people seem to know how to soften the impact of a supposedly hostile exchange? Information doesn't diffuse that cleanly without some form of signaling. And signaling doesn't require direct contact. It requires alignment. Alignment of expectations. Alignment of boundaries. Alignment of where the line is and where it isn't. This is where the idea of intermediaries becomes crucial, because intermediaries don't need instructions. They need understanding. They need to know what will land and what won't, what's acceptable and what crosses into damaged territory. And when multiple parties demonstrate that understanding consistently, observers begin to wonder whether that understanding is accidental. Now consider how this would look from the inside of a marriage. From one partner's perspective, everything appears as public conflict. Clear lines, defined enemies, no ambiguity. From the other partner's perspective, the landscape may be more complex, more negotiated, more strategic. Neither perspective is wrong, but they're not the same. And difference is where friction forms. According to media analysts, the rumors about communication gained traction, not because of salacious detail, but because they offered an explanation for something people had already sensed. Restraint. Why didn't the feud spiral further? Why did it plateau instead of explode? Why were certain lines never crossed? Restraint suggests awareness. Awareness suggests feedback. Feedback suggests channels. And channels suggest intermediaries. Once that framework entered the conversation, everything shifted. The question was no longer are they speaking directly, it became who speaks for whom, and who knows about it. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because in high-profile environments, intermediaries often operate with good intentions. They smooth tension, they reduce damage, they protect interests. But protection for one person can feel like exclusion to another. Imagine discovering that conversations about your life are happening without you in the room. Not because anyone is hiding something, but because that's just how the system works. That realization alone can be destabilizing. And for someone already sensitive to the idea of external manipulation, it's even more potent. Observers noted that Harry's withdrawal coincided with a subtle recalibration in how stories were framed across multiple platforms. Less personalization, more abstraction, fewer direct accusations, more commentary about dynamics and media ecosystems. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when people are careful. Careful about language, careful about tone, careful about not provoking something they can't control. Care suggests anticipation. Anticipation suggests communication, not necessarily between the main figures, but among those orbiting them. This is where the idea of a secret channel becomes misleading. It's not one channel. It's a web of overlapping interests, shared constraints, and unspoken rules about escalation. And when you're not fully aware of that web, it can feel like something is happening behind your back, even if no one intends it that way. For Harry, that web may have come into focus only after he stepped away. Distance changes perspective. When you're inside the noise, you react. When you step outside it, you analyze. And analysis reveals patterns reaction never does. According to speculation, Harry's time away wasn't spent consuming headlines. It was spent talking to advisors, to confidants, to people who could explain how narratives move when cameras aren't rolling. That kind of conversation can be eye-opening because it reframes conflict not as personal animosity, but as system behavior. And systems don't take sides, they respond to incentives. If public outrage benefits multiple parties, it persists. If escalation harms everyone, it stops. Understanding that can be disorienting, especially if you believed the conflict was principled rather than structural. And once you see conflict as structural questions, who manages the flow of information? Who decides what becomes public and what stays private? Who acts as the buffer between personalities? And crucially, who is aware of those buffers? Because awareness equals agency, and lack of awareness equals vulnerability. That's the emotional core of this chapter, not suspicion of wrongdoing. Suspicion of exclusion. When analysts discuss the destabilizing effect of intermediaries, they're not talking about betrayal. They're talking about asymmetry. Asymmetry in information. Asymmetry in influence. Asymmetry in understanding how the game is played. And in relationships, under pressure, asymmetry feels like imbalance. Imbalance feels unsafe. Unsafe triggers withdrawal, which brings us back to the moment Harry left. But it wasn't flight, it was recalibration. A move to rebalance information. To understand the system rather than fight it blindly. And once you understand the system, you stop reacting emotionally. You start making decisions strategically. That shift alone can look like detachment from the outside. But detachment doesn't mean indifference. It means processing. Observers who tracked media behavior during this period noted another telling detail. Certain voices went quiet. Not the loud critics, the subtle ones. The ones who usually add nuance, background, and context. Their silence suggested uncertainty about what could be said safely. Uncertainty implies boundaries were being renegotiated. And renegotiation implies communication, not necessarily with the main figures, but around them. This is how influence actually works. Rarely direct, often implied, almost always deniable, which is why rumors about communication channels felt plausible. Not because people believed in a secret relationship, but because they recognized the architecture. And architecture doesn't disappear just because no one names it. Here's the paradox. The more a couple insists they're free from media influence, the more unsettling it is to realize how embedded media influence actually is. You don't escape systems by rejecting them. You escape them by understanding them. And that understanding can be painful because it reveals how little control any individual really has, especially when narratives have momentum. At this stage, speculation shifted again. People stopped asking about emotions. They started asking about logistics. Who speaks to whom? Through what channels? With what awareness? And those questions don't need answers to have impact. They create a sense that something is happening beyond view. That sense alone is enough to fracture trust, not between enemies, but within partnerships. Because partnerships rely on shared understanding. And if one partner feels the system more clearly than the other, alignment suffers. That's the quiet tension underlying this chapter. Not jealousy, not betrayal, but the realization that the battlefield is bigger than either partner, and that one of them may understand it better. Which raises the final question of this chapter. If intermediaries existed, even informally, did Harry know the full scope of their influence? And if he didn't, when did he realize it? Because according to whispers circulating at the time, there was a moment during his absence when something clicked, not a revelation, but a recontextualization. A realization that the feud he thought he was fighting wasn't just personal. It was procedural, and once you see procedure, you stop fighting people. You start questioning systems. That shift changes everything, because systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to leverage, and leverage requires clarity. Clarity Harry may have only gained by stepping away. As this chapter closes, the focus narrows, because while intermediaries and channels explain the structure, they don't explain the spark. Something specific triggered this reckoning, something that made the abstract suddenly personal. According to those watching closely, that spark involved not a headline, but a message. Not a dramatic confession, but a fragment, a piece of information that reframed everything Harry thought he understood about who knew what and when. And when that fragment surfaced, it didn't explode. It settled. And once it settled, it refused to be ignored. What happens when you realize your blind spot isn't just in public perception, but inside your own home? That's the question analysts and insiders began asking about Prince Harry in the days following his retreat from Montecito. Because when the fragments of information, the whispers, the intermediaries, the patterns began to coalesce, one truth became clear. The disruption wasn't external. It was internal. Chapter 5 starts here, with the tension that doesn't announce itself in press conferences or headlines. It starts with the quiet, gnawing doubt that something fundamental might be misaligned in a marriage built under extreme scrutiny. Harry had always been characterized by his loyalty. His instinct is to protect, to stand shoulder to shoulder. That's why this moment was unprecedented. For someone whose instinct is confrontation, to clarify, to assert, to correct, he didn't react immediately. He withdrew. Withdrawal isn't defeat. It's recalibration. It's a defensive posture, not a surrender. And in high-pressure relationships, recalibration often signals an internal reckoning. So what was Harry processing? Observers suggest it was a combination of emotional and strategic factors. Emotional: how much of what he believed in publicly aligns with reality privately. Strategic: how much influence exists outside his control, even from parties previously dismissed as adversaries. These aren't dramatic accusations. They are reflections of human psychology under stress. The problem arises when your environment is amplified by the media and public scrutiny. Every whisper becomes a signal, every pause a statement, every absence a story. Harry's blind spot, as commentators call it, was realizing that control over narrative is more fragile than it seems. That trust isn't just about intentions, it's about access to information. Who knows what? Who is influencing what? And are you fully aware? This is where the psychological stakes intersect with rumor and reality. Distance from Montecito allowed Harry to observe patterns he couldn't see while inside the cycle. Silence, previously interpreted as calm, revealed gaps. Gaps previously invisible now seemed meaningful. Intermediaries, communications, offhand messages, all coalesced into a pattern. And patterns are dangerous. They imply agency, intent, influence. And for someone conditioned to understand manipulation and control, Recognizing a pattern you weren't aware of can feel like betrayal, not necessarily by action, but by omission. It's important to note, this isn't a moral judgment, it's a psychological observation. People process information differently. What may be routine or professional for one partner can feel secretive or destabilizing for another. In Harry's case, the blind spot likely triggered a cascading thought process. First, awareness, acknowledging that channels of communication existed that he hadn't fully accounted for. Second, evaluation, questioning the potential impact on trust and alignment. Third, action, withdrawing to assess, to understand, to regain perspective. Observers emphasize that this withdrawal wasn't isolation for its own sake, it was strategic. Distance allowed for recalibration, for mental and emotional clarity before re-engagement. But for the public, it looked like disappearance, which fueled speculation, which fed rumor cycles. Let's be precise about what that entails.